The friends who entered the hall saw that there were enough seats for them, otherwise the auditorium was dark and quiet, with the only lights being over their seats. They sat down, and when they did, those lights went out, and the new lights shone up on stage. It showed an old puppet stage as a small puppet on a string was pulled up and revealed the puppet to the crowd. An old puppet who was carved to look like a king with a crown on his head as he turned to the audience, and he bowed once before he spoke. Hello, everyone. My name is Charmant, the King of Hearts. I have been married over a dozen times and divorced 2 dozen times, he said to the last of the crowd as the puppet turned its dead eyes to the audience, when he made eye contact with a familiar half-golden eye, someone who was even more bound by strings than himself, although they would not see it that way. When you spend your entire life in strings, you think it's the only way you can move. You don't think about who is holding the strings. You only think about the fact you never learned how to walk without the strings. So you keep them there, even when everyone around you stops talking to you. They keep talking to the one who holds your strings. Still, the King of Hearts knew exactly who needed the story, and who the Wonderland wastes were made for. So the puppet lifted his arms and he bowed to the crowd, not even thinking about the one who held his strings. He had those same strings for so long that he stopped asking who was holding them now. Once he cared, once he asked, and more than once he had seen who held his strings. But every time he looked, it was always someone else holding his strings. So, as long as he never thought about who held his strings, he didn't have to be scared of the ones who were above him. Even though no one has held his strings in years, the Charmant did not know about this fact, and he did not know his choices were his own choices. He was someone who chose predetermination, and now that was how he lived his life, even if he was the only one controlling his actions. But now was not the time for the puppet to be philosophical. Now was the time to tell a story. I am a king. I once had a kingdom, though, an entire wonderland with incredible gifts, incredible people, and incredible stories. Stories are what give our world power, a lot like how stories work in your world. Stories give a history to the past. Stories give hope to the future, and stories give gifts to the present. We had so many stories in our world that no audience could hear them all. We had so many that no storyteller could share them all. We weren't perfect, but we were happy. There was always a new princess to save, always a new monster to defeat, always a new treasure to find, always an adventure for our charming royal. But something began corrupting the stories. It started small, so small it might have been easy to ignore if it wasn't like a sharp thorn in a briar rose. By the very nature of Wonderland, the horizon is always pushing further. You find a new adventure, and there's a new land to uncover. You hear a new story, and there's a new monster to fight. You tell your friend a rumor you misheard when you were drunk, and now there is a new treasure to unearth. Stories create our world, just as our world creates stories. And I heard a story of a new single princess, my future 13th bride, and potentially my 25th divorce, if it didn't work out. Her land was different from all of the others I had seen before. Briar Rose was the last of her line, ruling over an empire many times the size of Wonderland, an empire that was placed under an eternal preserving sleep that affected everyone in Queen Rose's land, from the highest of nobility to the lowest serf. The legends told us that any prince who kissed Briar Rose would free her and her people from the curse, and the prince would rule eternally over an obedient kingdom. So now confident that I could handle this trouble too, I traveled to the Briar Kingdom, and I saw that this kingdom was far darker than any I've seen so far. The wilds were overgrown, the crops would grow only corn that eavesdropped with their plentiful ears, and pumpkins that followed us with their carved eyes and hungry maws, carvings that were made by no hands. The skies were gray, the sun only visible for a bare hour a day at noon, and many strange creatures skittered around in the darkness beyond the reach of my torch. And when I made it to Briar Rose's castle, I saw how dark a place it truly was. It was nearly overgrown with roses that covered all but the highest towers of the castle, the raven black thorns as long as my fingers, petals as red as blood, and the stems as white as snow. I climbed the castle in an enchanted armor that could withstand all damage, and in the highest tower, with a window that was almost completely overgrown, I made it to where Briar Rose slept. In her bed, the center of her own personal bedroom, where she slept on sheets as black as obsidian, and where her bed was surrounded by many relics and treasures that were nearly as high as the ceiling, I did not notice the strangeness that is obvious to me now. How there was no torch in her room, how there was no silver among her many treasures, both golden and wooden, how there was no mirror in her room, even though I have yet to know a single royal who does not keep a magic mirror in their personal chambers. I did not think of the strangeness at that time. I only thought of the sleeping beauty in front of me. Laid out on her bed, she was dressed in an all-white nightgown. Her skin was as pale as ivory, her lips as red as strawberries, and her hair even more golden than sunlight. Her hands clasped over her heart, and in that darkness I could not even see her breathe, nor could I see her breath in that ice-cold room. I approached Briar Rose. I placed down my sword so it would not cut her. I put out the torch so it would not burn her, and I lifted my faceplate so I could kiss her, leaving my face vulnerable. When I kissed Briar Rose, her lips were colder than ice, as my lips lightly stuck to her, my breath visible as she inhaled, and it looked like my exhalations were inhaled by Briar Rose. As I contemplated how to separate from her, her eyes opened, and I could see her icy blue eyes as her frozen lips moved and pressed into mine further, as she wrapped her strong hands around my head, pushing my head close to hers, and in mere seconds, that wasn't enough for her, as she opened her lips, her tongue touching my own. The way her tongue tasted, it tasted foul, like maggots who infested meat before being ground into sausage, and it was also cold and slimy as her tongue wrapped around my tongue, putting it in her mouth, where it touched her teeth. Her teeth, sharp as a blade as she kept kissing me, drops of blood dripping into her mouth. Every breath I took was dead air she exhaled, and every breath she took was the warmth I exhaled. I struggled in her arms, but as I grew weaker, she grew stronger as I felt more and more of myself fall into her. My heartbeat grew weaker and weaker as the last drops of my blood were pushed into her mouth. Before I died, though, she lifted herself up, and a drop of both my blood and hers fell onto one of her treasures, a puppet of a king that she kept near her bed. In that puppet body, I watched as my body stopped moving, before she kissed the corpse that was me, and the body rose up. Now an undead thrall of hers, and I could hear from beyond her castle that her empire was waking up. She transformed into a beastly bat that stood as tall as a man, and she flew out of the room, carrying my cursed corpse along with it. And now stuck in the body of a puppet, I made my way home to Wonderland, while avoiding being seen by the many monsters of Briar Rose's empire, monsters that had a chance to wake up and share their own stories, and to finally make their way to Wonderland. And as I made my trek home, I watched my home change in real time as the stories got darker and the land got darker to match those stories. Bandits went from people who could be bested with riddle and wit to murderers who left women and children dead on the edge of the road, leaving widowers and childless fathers to tell the stories of the bandits. The wolves no longer howled in the distance as a reminder to children to stay close to home. The wolves now roamed the roads, following children and even breaking into homes, pretending to be relatives to get close to children. Petty princes, once proud to prove themselves, became greedy and vain. Once they were dragon slayers, people saviors, and saviors of sheep. Now they demanded taxation from a population whose gold vanished in the night. They slayed those who slighted them just to prove that they were strong. The dragons now worked alongside the princes, demanding food, gold and food in exchange for loyalty, as princes who once never led anything more complicated than a taco stand were now in charge of entire kingdoms. The wizards, once wise wanderers who helped anyone who asked them for help, now grew distant, locked away in towers either by themselves or by power greater than their own. And with the wizards now difficult to find and even more difficult to reach, the people of Wonderland had to seek magic in different ways. They now sought out the witches, once distant hermits who bothered no one, who now demanded children and human flesh in exchange for their magic. And when the winters grew long and the springs grew short, one child lost is surely better than all of them. The worst part of all was the knights. Some of them abandoned their honor and chivalry when they realized it was no good to them anymore. They needed to feed themselves and their families. Honor couldn't keep them warm, chivalry didn't keep them fed, and heroics often got good men dead. Those who abandoned their code often turned to banditry themselves, or they would join the dragons and witches into preying on the population. And most knights who kept their honor found it tested every day. It's easy to give away a meal to a hungry mother when you know where and when your next meal is coming from. It's a lot harder to give away your dinner when it was the only food you had for 3 days. It's a lot easier to ask yourself to give your life for someone else when you know that they would do the same for you. But distrust breeds distrust, as even the best remaining knights found themselves making choices they never would have back when I was still king. And now instead they have the Queen of Hearts, Briar Rose, the vampire queen of Wonderland, ruling over all. The corpse of the King of Hearts ruling alongside her, his head long since fell off, and where he haunts the roads of Wonderland with his favorite and most loyal black horse. And as Wonderland grew darker, people began to call it Wasteland. But even in all of that darkness, some light remains. Children are still told stories about those who slay monsters. They are told how sunlight drives evil away, and how moonlight reveals a person's true nature. So the sun still rises, and moonlight still reveals who is a wolf and who is a strigoi. And even if the heroic knights are gone, there are those who now haunt the monsters. There are villages that still tell of clever deals with fae and witch alike that keeps the village is safe from the forces of the Queen of Hearts. Those villages burn every rose that grows, they slay every monster that sneaks in, and they still share riddles and stories that give courage against impossible odds. But now know this, travelers, when you make your way into my former kingdom, you will be wandering through Wonderland and Wasteland alike. Know that your choices will tip whether it all becomes Wasteland or if Wonderland can return.